A murder, suicide, or the perfect cover-up? A question from the past haunts Poirot. But the answer is far deadlier than anyone imagined. The morning air was crisp, laced with the scent of damp earth and the promise of an early frost. In the heart of an idyllic English town, where cobbled streets wound like veins through the sleepy village, Hercule Poirot enjoyed the rare luxury of a peaceful stroll. The sun, weak yet hopeful, filtered through the amber canopy of autumn leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. His thoughts, often troubled by the weight of the world's mysteries, felt light for once, as if the quiet of the countryside had the power to calm even the sharpest of minds. But tranquility, as it often does, proved to be fleeting. A soft, hurried footstep broke the rhythm of his walk, and a familiar voice, strained and urgent, called out his name. Hercule, Hercule. Ariadne Oliver, the celebrated crime writer whose mind was as sharp as her wit, came running toward him, her face pale and drawn, a far cry from the usual lively energy that characterized her. Her normally vibrant eyes were clouded with a worry that instantly set Poirot's own senses on edge. "You must listen to me, Poirot," she said, her breath ragged from the effort of her brisk pace. Her voice trembled, barely concealing the underlying panic. "At a party last night, someone asked a most chilling question about the Ravenscrofts." Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed as he adjusted the angle of his hat. The Ravenscrofts, that name was a shadow that had haunted the town for years, their deaths long believed to be a tragic murder-suicide, the cause of which had been buried under a veil of silence. General Ravenscroft, a man of impeccable military honor, and his wife Margaret, who had once been the epitome of grace and beauty, a night of unimaginable horror, the truth of which had never fully surfaced. "Why now?" Poirot asked, his voice steady but his curiosity piqued. "After all these years, what more could possibly be uncovered about that which is long buried?" Ariadne shook her head, her fingers trembling slightly as she grasped Poirot's arm. "That's just it, Hercule. Someone in that room, someone who knew far too much, asked a question. A question that made my blood run cold. Was Margaret Ravenscroft truly killed by her husband? Or was there another, far darker truth hidden in the shadows?" Poirot's lips thinned. A question, not an accusation, but a question nonetheless. It was the spark that could reignite a fire long extinguished. The same fire that burned with unanswered truths and secrets best left alone. "There are whispers, Hercule," Ariadne continued, her voice soft but laden with fear. "Whispers that Margaret may have been murdered by someone else entirely. That the real killer has been walking among us all these years, undetected. The truth has been forgotten, but for how long?" A brief silence hung between them, thick with tension. Poirot's mind raced, turning over the possibilities, each more chilling than the last. And yet, despite the unsettling nature of it all, a part of him was intrigued. Ariadne was never one to entertain such notions lightly. If she believed there was something to this, Poirot had no choice but to follow. "But why now?" he asked again, his eyes scanning the landscape of the town as if the answer might be hidden in its quiet streets. Ariadne's eyes flickered with something Poirot could not quite place. "I don't know, Hercule," she whispered. "But I fear the past is coming back to haunt us, and if we don't act quickly, another shadow, one far darker than the first, may rise from the ashes of that forgotten tragedy." Poirot took a slow breath, his mind already working, formulating a plan as he met Ariadne's anxious gaze. "Then we must uncover this mystery before it is lost forever." He paused, watching the play of emotions cross her face, before he added with a faint, knowing smile, "And let us hope, for the sake of all concerned, that we do not uncover something we are not meant to know." Ariadne swallowed hard, her grip tightening on his arm. "Please, Hercule, before it's too late." The two of them stood there, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a storm on the horizon. Poirot knew that this was not just another case. This was a challenge, one that would unravel a thread long buried, revealing something that had been concealed for far too long. And as they walked toward the Ravenscroft estate, the town seemed to hold its breath, as if the very ground beneath their feet sensed the return of a past that had never truly been laid to rest. Cliffhanger. As Poirot and Ariadne approach the Ravenscroft estate, a sharp, chilling scream echoes through the distance. The mystery of the Ravenscrofts had just begun, but was it already too late? The Ravenscroft estate stood shrouded in an eerie stillness, the once grand mansion now draped in layers of ivy, its walls heavy with secrets long forgotten. The scent of damp earth mingled with the faint trace of decay as Hercule Poirot and Ariadne Oliver stood at the entrance, gazing at the silent ruins of a place once filled with laughter and life. As they crossed the threshold, the creaking of the old wooden doors echoed through the house, as if the very walls were protesting their return. The air inside was thick with dust, the light barely filtering through the cracked windows, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch toward them. "It's as though time has stopped here," Ariadne whispered, her voice barely a murmur, as if afraid to disturb the peace that had settled in the mansion. Poirot nodded, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, every forgotten corner. There was something unsettling about the silence, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to be uncovered. They moved deeper into the heart of the mansion, their footsteps muffled by the worn, faded carpets. In the drawing room, Poirot's eyes landed on an old photograph, framed and faded with age. Margaret Ravenscroft smiled in the picture, her beauty captured in a moment frozen in time, but beside her there was another woman identical in every way, Dorothea. Her face was an eerie mirror of Margaret's, but her eyes held a darkness, a hint of something that made Poirot's pulse quicken. "Two sisters," Ariadne murmured, peering over his shoulder. "But there's only ever been mention of Margaret, nothing about a twin." Poirot's brow furrowed as he studied the image. A twin, or a shadow. A twin who might have been lost, forgotten, or deliberately erased from history. Ariadne's hand fluttered to her lips. But why would she be erased? Before Poirot could answer, the sound of footsteps reached their ears, slow, deliberate, coming from the hall behind them. The housekeeper, a stooped woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, entered the room, her gaze wary but respectful. "Mr. Poirot, Miss Oliver," she said softly, her voice thick with the weight of years. "I trust you've come to learn the truth. It's a dangerous thing, you know. Uncovering old ghosts." Poirot turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Ghosts, you say? You have heard whispers then, madame?" The housekeeper hesitated, glancing toward the shadows, as if fearful someone or something might be listening. "Strange sounds, before the tragedy. Whispers and laughter, in the dead of night. I thought I was imagining things at first, but no, it wasn't just me. Others heard it too. And then, the screams, the sound of something terrible breaking." Ariadne's eyes widened. "The night of the tragedy." "Yes," the housekeeper replied, her voice trembling. It was as though the house was alive with something darker than just sorrow, something unnatural. Poirot remained silent for a moment, his mind piecing together the fragments. Whispers, laughter, and then screams, all before the supposed murder-suicide. There was something else lurking here, something hidden beneath the surface. "Tell me, madame," Poirot said, his voice calm but piercing. "Did anyone notice anything peculiar about Madame Ravenscroft before?" The housekeeper sighed, her gaze distant, as though she were trying to recall a memory locked away in the recesses of her mind. "Madame Margaret," she grew, strange, towards the end. Paranoid. She would sit in her rooms for hours, staring out the window, muttering to herself, talking about them, about her sister, saying she could hear her footsteps in the halls. She became convinced that Dorothea was still alive. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and Ariadne leaned in, eager to hear more. "The doctors said it was just nerves," the housekeeper continued, her voice lowering to a whisper. "But there was something off. Margaret was afraid of something, or someone." Poirot's instincts flared, his mind already connecting the dots. A twin who might have been forgotten, a woman who grew paranoid, and strange sounds that suggested a presence far more dangerous than simple insanity. Was it possible that Margaret Ravenscroft's fear had been justified? Was her death truly a murder-suicide, or was there something more sinister at play? "Thank you, madame," Poirot said, his voice smooth but with an edge that hinted at the tension beneath. "But we will need to speak to others. There are still many questions left unanswered." As they left the drawing room and wandered deeper into the mansion, a new revelation began to form. The house, silent as it was, held its own version of the truth hidden in corners, sealed away in forgotten rooms. But would Poirot find it before it was too late? They moved toward the library, where the next part of the puzzle was waiting. As they opened the heavy wooden door, the faintest sound, a rustle of paper, reached their ears. Poirot turned quickly, his eyes catching the gleam of something on a dusty shelf. It was a letter, one that had clearly been moved recently, yet its presence here was utterly out of place. Before he could reach for it, a loud crash from the floor above echoed through the mansion, followed by a scream that made Ariadne freeze. Poirot's eyes flashed with realization. The truth was close, too close, and someone was desperate to stop them from finding it. Cliffhanger. Poirot's hand hovered over the letter, but before he could grab it, the scream echoed again, this time louder, more frantic. Someone was in danger, and the clock was ticking. In the dim light of a late afternoon, Poirot found himself seated in the somber parlor of the Ravenscroft family homia room that, despite its faded elegance, exuded an aura of lingering sorrow and secrets. The faded wallpaper, patterned with delicate roses and vines, now bore the weight of untold memories, each crease a silent witness to the past. Across from him sat Celia Ravenscroft, the only living remnant of a once proud lineage. Her eyes, a pale echo of her mother's, darted nervously about the room. Clutched in her trembling hands was a small worn locket, a relic from a happier time, perhaps now serving as her only shield against the oppressive memories of her parents' tragic end. "Miss Ravenscroft," Poirot began softly, his voice measured and gentle. "I understand that the events surrounding your parents have left you deeply troubled. Perhaps you might share your recollections with me." Celia's gaze fell to the locket, and for a long moment she remained silent. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she replied, "I have spent my entire life living in the shadow of that dreadful night. There was always an undercurrent, a secret I couldn't quite grasp." Her fingers caressed the locket as though seeking comfort from its familiar weight. Poirot's keen eyes never left hers. "A secret, you say? I wonder if you might elaborate further." He leaned forward, his tone both inviting and probing, as if coaxing a reluctant confession from a hidden well of memories. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she hesitated, then spoke in a fractured cadence. "My mother, Margaret, was never the same after that night. I remember her eyes, wide with fear, as though she was haunted by a presence that only she could see. And my father, General Ravenscroft, was consumed by duty, his demeanor cold, distant, as if he was always fighting an enemy that lurked in the periphery of his thoughts." Her voice broke, and she clutched the locket closer, as if it might somehow contain the truth. Poirot noted every quiver in her voice, every subtle shift in her expression. "And did you ever hear anything unusual before the tragedy took hold?" he inquired, the quiet intensity of his words sharpening the atmosphere. Celia's gaze flickered to the darkened corner of the room, as if the shadows themselves held the answer. "There were whispers, Monsieur Poirot," she confessed, her voice low and laden with dread. "At night, I would sometimes hear a soft, almost indistinguishable laughter coming from the corridors. I believed it to be my imagination at first, but later I began to wonder, could it be that something else was there, something I was never meant to understand?" As she spoke, a sudden chill swept through the room, and the wind outside howled as if echoing her hidden terror. Poirot leaned back, his mind piecing together the fragments of her recollections with the larger tapestry of the Ravenscroft mystery. Her testimony hinted at something deeper, a secret that had been shrouded in silence, waiting to be unearthed. Just then, as if on cue, a soft knock sounded at the door of the parlor. Celia's eyes widened in alarm, and she hesitated as if fearing what or who might be on the other side. Poirot exchanged a brief, knowing glance with her. In that moment, the air grew thick with anticipation, as though the walls themselves were conspiring to reveal the next piece of the puzzle. "Who could it be at this hour?" Celia murmured, her voice trembling with both curiosity and dread. Poirot rose slowly, his impeccable manner belying the storm of thoughts swirling within him. "We shall see, mademoiselle," he replied softly, his tone promising both caution and revelation. He moved toward the door, each step measured, while Celia's anxious eyes followed him, a mixture of hope and fear dancing in their depths. As Poirot reached for the door handle, the knock came again, firmer this time, as if the visitor was impatient. With a final lingering glance back at Celia, he whispered, "The truth, it seems, is knocking at our door." And with that, the door creaked open, leaving both Poirot and Celia on the precipice of another revelation known that promised to unravel further the tangled web of mystery surrounding the Ravenscrofts, and perhaps expose secrets too dangerous to be kept hidden. Cliffhanger. Who stood on the threshold, a long-forgotten figure from the past, or a stranger with ties to a truth that Celia had so desperately tried to forget? The answer lay just beyond the door, waiting to plunge them deeper into the enigma of the Ravenscroft legacy. The next day, Poirot and Ariadne made their way to Major Hector Blunt's estate. The soldier's home was tucked away at the edge of the town, on a stretch of land that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The house, while imposing, stood stark against the overcast sky, its sharp angles and faded grandeur mirroring the man at Howe's stoic, unyielding, and wrapped in layers of restraint. Major Blunt, a man whose presence could silence a room, greeted them at the door with the practiced courtesy of a soldier who had long since traded in camaraderie for distance. His sharp eyes, cold and calculating, took in Poirot and Ariadne as they entered, but it was his silences, deliberate lack of words, that spoke volumes. The very air seemed to press in on them, thick with unspoken tension. Poirot wasted no time. "Major Blunt," he said, his voice steady yet probing, "you and General Ravenscroft were close, yes, a relationship forged in service and camaraderie." Blunt's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting toward the window as if something just beyond the glass demanded his attention. For a moment, he seemed a man lost in thought, haunted perhaps by memories he could not or would not share. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and measured. "We served together," Blunt said, his eyes narrowing. "The general was a man of duty, nothing more, nothing less. His wife, on the other hand, well, that was a different story." Poirot's keen eyes never wavered. "And what of the tragic night? The deaths of the Ravenscrofts? Do you have any insight? Any detail that might illuminate what truly happened?" Blunt's expression darkened, and for a split second, a flicker of unease crossed his features. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. "I'm afraid my memory isn't as sharp as it used to be," he said, the words carrying an edge of finality, as though he was closing a door that had been opened too many times. But Poirot wasn't so easily deterred. "Of course, Major. But tell me, what was the nature of the general's relationship with his wife? Was there any tension between them in the days leading up to that night?" Blunt hesitated, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair. Then, in a voice tinged with bitterness, he muttered, "The general was burdened, haunted, if you will. The war had done things to him, things no man should have to carry. Margaret, his wife, she tried. God knows she tried to understand. But the pressure, it broke something inside him. And Margaret, she was never the same after the war, always looking over her shoulder, like there was something waiting to pounce." Poirot absorbed his words carefully, noting every subtle shift in Blunt's demeanor, every slight change in the tone of his voice. There was more here, more than Blunt was willing to admit. As they left Major Blunt's estate, Poirot's mind was whirling, every clue weaving itself into a pattern he was only beginning to understand. But there was more to be learned. They needed another perspective, someone who had been on the periphery of it all, watching from the sidelines. Mrs. Buckley, the local neighbor, had a reputation for knowing everyone's business. She had lived next door to the Ravenscrofts for years, and by all accounts had seen more than her fair share of things she should not have. The perfect person to ask, Poirot mused, though he could sense a shrewdness behind her eyes that made him cautious. As they arrived at Mrs. Buckley's home, it became clear that she was not one to welcome visitors lightly. The small cottage stood at the edge of the village, its windows darkened with heavy curtains. A faint scent of old books and dust lingered in the air, and the garden, once tidy and cared for, now appeared wild and untamed, much like its owner. Mrs. Buckley opened the door with a thin smile, her eyes gleaming with a kind of knowingness that made the hairs on the back of Poirot's neck stand on end. "I've been expecting you, Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice soft yet sharp, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "You want to hear what I know about the Ravenscrofts, and believe me, I know plenty." Ariadne shot a quick glance at Poirot, her curiosity piqued. Poirot, however, remained composed, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied Mrs. Buckley. "Indeed, madam, you have lived here for many years, and as I understand it, you remember everything." Mrs. Buckley chuckled a low, throaty laugh that sent a chill down Ariadne's spine. "Oh, I do. I remember the way the house used to echo with laughter before it all went dark. How Margaret's laughter would fill the halls, and the General's voice, so commanding, so full of life." She paused for a moment, her eyes narrowing, and then added with a smirk, "But there were whispers too, Mr. Poirot. Whispers in the night that no one wanted to acknowledge. And I remember who was there the night everything changed." Poirot's gaze sharpened, his attention fully fixed on Mrs. Buckley. "Who, madam? Who was there?" Mrs. Buckley leaned in, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "It was Blunt. Major Blunt. He never left that night. I saw him as shadow moving in the dark. And after that, the house, well, let's just say it was never the same." Her words hung in the air like a poisoned chalice, both a revelation and a warning. Poirot's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her statement, each word carrying weight and suspicion. Just as Poirot opened his mouth to ask more, the door behind Mrs. Buckley creaked. A shadow passed by the window, casting a fleeting, almost imperceptible movement across the room. Mrs. Buckley's eyes flickered to the door, her smile vanishing. "Ah," she whispered, "it seems someone else wishes to join our conversation." The door swung open, and standing there, silhouetted in the doorway, was someone Poirot had never expected to see again. Cliffhanger. Who stood at the threshold? A figure from the past, or someone more sinister, with ties to the Ravenscroft mystery that Poirot had yet to uncover? The answer, poised just on the other side of that door, promised to change everything. Poirot and Ariadne made their way through the mist-covered streets of the small village, the heavy fog clinging to the cobblestones beneath their feet. The tension in the air seemed almost palpable as they approached their next stop, the home of Dr. Willoughby, the Ravenscroft's trusted family physician. Dr. Willoughby's house stood at the far edge of the village, its tall stone walls looming like a watchful sentinel. A single light flickered in the window, casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow pathway leading to the front door. It was a house that seemed to carry secrets in every corner, as if the very walls themselves held their breath, waiting to reveal something dark and hidden. When they rang the doorbell, the sound echoed through the stillness, sharp and urgent. A moment passed, and then the door creaked open with unsettling slowness, revealing the doctor himself. His appearance was exactly as Ariadne remembered, tall, with a gaunt face and piercing eyes that always seemed to observe more than they let on. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed to blend with the shadows, and his expression was unreadable, too calm for a man who was about to be questioned about the deaths of his longtime patients. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, doctor," Willoughby said, his voice smooth and composed, though there was a flicker of something else, something fleeting in his eyes. "And Miss Oliver, what brings you to my humble abode on such a night?" Poirot stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the doctor's face. "We are investigating the deaths of General Ravenscroft and his wife, Margaret. You were, as I understand, the family physician. I am sure you recall their final days very well." Ariadne watched as Dr. Willoughby's face tightened ever so slightly, his lips pressing together in a thin line. For a moment, the doctor seemed to contemplate his response, and Poirot could feel the weight of his hesitation in the air. "Yes," Dr. Willoughby said finally, his voice even, betraying none of the turmoil that was surely brewing beneath the surface. "I remember them well. The Ravenscrofts were a troubled family, Monsieur Poirot. But then, aren't we all troubled in some way?" He gave a small, unsettling smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Poirot, ever sharp, didn't miss the subtle shift in the doctor's demeanor. "Troubled? In what way?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, a glint of suspicion hidden beneath his calm tone. Dr. Willoughby seemed to consider this question for a moment, his eyes briefly flicking toward the shadows of his home. His gaze returned to Poirot, and he finally spoke, his words heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. "General Ravenscroft, he suffered. The war had changed him. I treated him for many years, and I saw the toll it took on his mind and body. But Margaret, she was a different case entirely. She became unwell in a way that went beyond the ordinary. She had dreams, visions, things she couldn't explain. She would speak of a darkness that haunted her, something lurking in the house." Poirot leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "Visions? And did she tell you what she saw? What did she fear?" Dr. Willoughby hesitated, his fingers absently stroking the edge of the doorframe. His expression grew darker, as though the weight of the memory was suddenly too much to bear. "She never said much, but I know she confided in someone. She wasn't as alone as people thought. I had my suspicions, but as a physician, I am bound by confidentiality." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "But there was more to Margaret's death than anyone realized. More than the public was ever told." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his instincts telling him that the good doctor was holding back. "What do you mean, more? Did you have a reason to suspect foul play?" Dr. Willoughby's face remained carefully composed, but his gaze faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough to suggest a deep, hidden truth. "I am a man of science, Monsieur Poirot. I trust in evidence, not speculation. But when I performed the autopsy on Margaret, I found something unusual, a trace of poison, a rare, almost undetectable toxin." The words hit like a blow. Poison, a rare toxin. It couldn't be a coincidence. The silence in the room deepened, as though the very air had thickened with the weight of his revelation. Poirot's mind raced. The implications of this discovery were immense. Was Margaret murdered, or had she taken her own life, as some had suspected? And if poison had been involved, where had it come from? Was it connected to the General's death, or was someone else pulling the strings, someone with access to the Ravenscroft household? You never mentioned this before," Poirot said, his voice steady but his mind turning over the new information like a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit. "Why now? Why tell us this now?" Dr. Willoughby's eyes flickered with something grit, perhaps, or was it fear? He took a step back, the door creaking on its hinges, as though it were reluctant to let them in any further. "Because," he said softly, "I have been waiting for someone like you, Monsieur Poirot. Someone who will see what I have been hiding all these years. Someone who will uncover the truth. And perhaps in doing so, we will all be forced to confront what really happened that night." Just as Poirot opened his mouth to probe further, a sharp noise echoed from within the house, an unmistakable sound, the unmistakable click of a door closing. Ariadne turned, startled, but Dr. Willoughby's expression didn't change. He simply smiled, though the smile didn't reach his eyes. "I believe that is your answer," he said, his voice tinged with something darker now. "The truth lies just beyond that door. But be warned, Monsieur Poirot, some doors, once opened, should never be closed again." The door behind him creaked open, revealing a shadowed hallway, its end obscured by darkness. Cliffhanger. What awaited them down the hallway? A hidden room, a secret that had been locked away for years. And would they be able to uncover the final piece of the Ravenscroft mystery before it consumed them all? The moment stood on the edge of revelation, and Poirot knew one thing for certain: was about to be drawn into a web far more tangled than he ever expected. The night had deepened, and the wind outside seemed to howl with an eerie intensity as Poirot and Ariadne made their way back to the Ravenscroft estate. The estate loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. Each step they took brought them closer to the truth, but the closer they came, the more elusive the answers seemed to be. Poirot's mind was racing. The web of lies, secrets, and half-truths surrounding the Ravenscroft family was growing more tangled by the hour. As he and Ariadne entered the drawing room, the atmosphere felt heavy, thick with the weight of what had already been revealed and the far greater mystery still to be unraveled. The suspects had been carefully scrutinized, each one seeming to hide something just out of reach, as though they were all holding on to fragments of the truth, fragments that didn't quite fit together. The first to speak was Celia Ravenscroft. The once vibrant daughter of the General and Margaret had withered under the weight of her own guilt and fear. Now, she was nothing more than a nervous shell of the young woman she had been. She sat stiffly in a chair near the fire, her eyes darting around the room, never meeting Poirot's gaze for more than a fleeting second. "I never meant for any of it to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My parents were. They were never the same after the war. After my father came back, he changed." Her words hung in the air, thick with unspoken emotion, but Poirot could sense the contradictions in her tone. There was something in her eyes, something hidden. A lie, or perhaps a fear of something far worse than she dared admit. Poirot studied her, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. "You were close to them, yes. To your mother, to your father. And yet, you speak as though you were distant from the tragedy that unfolded. Why is that, Mademoiselle Ravenscroft?" Celia's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she lowered her head, clasping her hands tightly together. The tension in the room was palpable, but before Poirot could press further, the door creaked open and in walked Major Hector, blunt-rigid and stern, like a man who had long since buried his emotions under a mask of stoic indifference. His presence seemed to fill the room, and yet there was an unsettling emptiness in his gaze. A man of war, but one who carried more than the scars of battle. "I told you before, Poirot," Blunt said, his voice gruff. "There's nothing more to say. The General was my friend. We served together in the trenches. And after the war, well, we all tried to move on, didn't we?" His tone was sharp, but there was a flicker of something darker, guilt, or perhaps shame. Poirot leaned forward slightly, sensing the unsaid words hanging in the air like an unsolved riddle. "And yet," Poirot pressed, "you are here. You wish to ensure the truth is uncovered, yes? Or is it simply your own conscience that demands it?" Blunt stiffened, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Poirot thought he would say more, but then the man turned away, his face hidden in the shadows. "Conscience," Blunt muttered. "Sometimes the truth is better left buried." Ariadne glanced at Poirot, her brow furrowed in confusion, but before she could speak, Mrs. Buckley, the ever watchful, ever curious neighbor, stepped into the room with her usual air of unwelcome intrusion. Her sharp eyes were always alert, always calculating, as though she were constantly watching, always searching for that one detail that might slip through the cracks. "I remember everything, you know," Mrs. Buckley said, her voice thin and brittle, like the crackling fire. "Everything that happened that night, the laughter, the screams, the way the house seemed to hold its breath. But there's one thing I can't forget. The way Margaret Ravenscroft looked just before she paused, as if realizing she had nearly said too much. Well, it doesn't matter, does it? The truth is already out there, buried in the past." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And you believe you know the truth, Mrs. Buckley? Or is it merely the rumors that you have clung to?" She smiled, a smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "Oh, I know more than I should, Monsieur Poirot. I've seen things, heard things, things that no one else would believe." Her voice trailed off, leaving a lingering sense of unease in its wake. Poirot stood up slowly, his thoughts spinning. Each of them, Celia, Blunt, Mrs. Buckley, was hiding something. They spoke of the past, but their words were laced with contradictions. And then there was Dr. Willoughby, whose medical expertise had provided a chilling new clue: poison, a rare toxin. But how far did the doctor's involvement truly go? Was he simply a physician bound by his oath, or was he more deeply entangled in the Ravenscroft tragedy than anyone dared imagine? As Poirot turned back to face the group, his mind raced through the possibilities. Nothing was adding up. Each of them held a piece of the puzzle, but none seemed trustworthy enough to offer a complete picture. They were all keeping secrets, afraid of what the truth might reveal. And then, just as Poirot was about to speak, there came a soft knock at the door. It was a quiet sound, but it sent a ripple of tension through the room. The door opened, and in stepped a shadowy figure, draped in a cloak so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure's face was hidden, but the air in the room shifted, as if something or someone had entered who was not meant to be there. The figure stepped forward slowly, and Poirot's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary visitor. The weight of their presence felt like an omen. Cliffhanger. Who was this mysterious figure? Was it someone from the past, or had the truth finally come to claim its due? As the figure's footsteps echoed in the silence, Poirot knew that this was the moment everything would change. The final piece of the puzzle was about to be revealed, and the revelation would change everything. The air in the Ravenscroft estate had become thick with secrets, each room steeped in the echoes of a past that no one seemed willing to fully confront. Poirot and Ariadne stood in the dimly lit library, the faint smell of aged paper and dust hanging in the air. Poirot had just discovered a hidden compartment in the oak bookshelf, a secret drawer that had escaped the notice of generations. Inside it, wrapped in a delicate velvet cloth, lay a diary, Margaret Ravenscroft's diary. Ariadne, her curiosity piqued, leaned over Poirot's shoulder, watching as he carefully flipped through the pages. The handwriting was elegant, the ink fading in places, but the words seemed to pulse with an unsettling urgency. Poirot's fingers paused on a particular entry, and his eyes darkened as he read aloud. "I fear Dorothea is no longer a memory. She is here. She watches, waits, and she will not stop until she has what she believes is hers. I do not know if I can escape. Hirsch is too strong, too determined. My heart races, my thoughts betray me, and I wonder, has she come back to finish what she started?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Ariadne's breath caught in her throat as she looked at Poirot, who appeared to be deep in thought, his brow furrowed with the weight of this new revelation. Margaret had a twin, Dorothea twin, who had been presumed dead after a mysterious disappearance years ago. But now the diary hinted at something far more chilling. Dorothea might have returned. The twin, long thought to be gone, might have been lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Poirot closed the diary gently, his mind racing with the implications. Dorothea's return explained much the eerie atmosphere surrounding the Ravenscroft estate, the paranoia that had plagued Margaret before her death, the whispers in the halls that no one could explain. Dorothea wasn't a mere ghost of the past. She was very real, and very dangerous. Ariadne took a step back, her mind reeling from the discovery. But why would Margaret hide this? Why keep it a secret for so long? Poirot's gaze was distant, focused on a point beyond the room. "Because, mademoiselle, some truths are too terrifying to face, and sometimes it is better to let the past remain buried." His voice was heavy with the weight of his own experience with such cases. He had seen how easily the past could bleed into the present, how dangerous it could be when old wounds were reopened. Suddenly, a sharp, jarring sound broke the tension, the crash of glass shattering somewhere in the house. Ariadne's eyes widened, and before she could say anything, Poirot was already moving, his instinctual sharpness taking over. He gestured for her to stay back, and followed the sound of the breaking glass down a narrow hallway that led to a rear terrace. The scene they encountered was nothing short of a nightmare. Ariadne was lying on the ground, blood trickling from a gash on her forehead where a shard of glass had struck her. She had been standing by the open terrace window, looking out over the estate, when the window exploded outward, as if someone had thrown a heavy object into it. Poirot dropped to his knees beside her, his heart pounding in his chest as he checked for signs of life. She was breathing, but unconscious, her pulse faint. "Ariadne," he called softly, But she didn't respond. The sight of her lying motionless sent a chill through him. This wasn't just an accident. It was a message, a warning. Poirot's mind whirled as he stood up, surveying the scene. The broken glass scattered across the terrace, the gaping hole in the window, and the faintest trace of movement outside in the shadow. Something was amiss. He glanced back at Ariadne's still form, feeling a surge of protectiveness, but he knew that whatever this was, it had just escalated to a far more dangerous level. He had to act. This was no longer just a case of a forgotten family tragedy. This was a fight against something far darker. Someone was trying to prevent him from uncovering the truth, and the attempt on Ariadne's life made it all too clear that they would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. Poirot rushed to the window, his eyes scanning the grounds below. The estate was sprawling, its vast garden and estate walls providing plenty of places for someone to hide. His mind raced through the possibilities, but one thing was certain. Dorothea's return had set something into motion, something that no one in the Ravenscroft family had prepared for. And then, as Poirot turned to leave the terrace, he heard a faint, distant voice, a whisper carried on the wind, or perhaps it was his imagination. But it sounded like a name, Margaret. And it was followed by a single chilling sentence, "I will finish what she started." Poirot froze, the weight of the words sinking in like a stone. Was this Dorothea speaking, or was it someone else? The danger was closing in, and Poirot knew that time was running out. The killer was still out there, hiding in plain sight, and they were willing to go to any lengths to protect their twisted legacy. Cliffhanger. With Ariadne's life hanging in the balance, and a new threat emerging from the shadows, Poirot knew that every step forward would bring him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. But he had no choice. The game had changed, and he was in it now, whether he liked it or not. What was Dorothea's ultimate plan? And would Poirot be able to stop her before it was too late? The wind howled outside the Ravenscroft mansion, the once grand house now standing like a silent sentinel to the twisted secrets it had kept buried for years. Inside, Poirot had gathered the key players of the mystery, each one unknowingly stepping into a trap set with precision and care. The tension in the room was palpable as Poirot stood at the center, his sharp eyes scanning each of them as if measuring their every breath. Ariadne had recovered, though the shadows of what had happened still clung to her. She sat beside Poirot, her eyes filled with an unspoken question, a mix of fear and curiosity, as they waited for the revelations that would shake them all to the core. The house was dimly lit, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere thick with dread. Poirot's voice broke the silence, calm and deliberate, yet carrying the weight of years of deception. "You have all been living with a lie," he began, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The murder of General Ravenscroft and his wife Margaret was never what it seemed. There was no murder, suicide. The truth, my friends, is far darker. He paused for a moment, watching as each of them processed the weight of his words. There was a collective shift in the room: anxiety, suspicion, disbelief. Poirot stepped forward, his gaze landing on Celia Ravenscroft, whose eyes widened with a mix of terror and recognition. "Celia," Poirot said softly, "do you remember your mother's twin sister, Dorothea?" Celia's breath caught in her throat. But Dorothea died years ago," she stammered, her voice shaking. She drowned in the lake, we were told." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "That is what you were told, but the truth is far more complicated. Dorothea did not drown. She survived, and for years she watched, she waited. And when the time came, she took on a new identity, Margaret's." The room seemed to close in around them as Poirot's words sank in. Celia's face went pale, her eyes flickering with confusion and disbelief. "Number that can't be true. It would have been impossible to impersonate her all those years." Her voice trailed off, her mind struggling to process the enormity of what Poirot was suggesting. Poirot's gaze sharpened. It was not impossible. Dorothea was driven by a deep-seated need for control, and her mind, unstable as it was willing to do anything to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. Ariadne, who had been silently absorbing the scene, finally spoke. But if Dorothea was alive all this time, why did she kill Margaret? Why not just claim her place? Poirot's eyes darkened as he turned toward her. Because Dorothea was not just a woman consumed by jealousy, she was a woman tortured by her own demons. The confrontation between Margaret and Dorothea was not just one of rivalry, it was a violent clash of fractured minds. Margaret, realizing what had happened, tried to confront her sister. But Dorothea, in her madness, could not allow the truth to surface. The weight of Poirot's words hung in the air, as everyone in the room processed the harrowing implications. But Poirot wasn't done yet. He moved toward the fireplace, where the flames flickered menacingly, casting shadows that seemed to dance like specters of the past. The tragedy that followed Margaret's death, General Ravenscroft's subsequent grief, was not the end of the story. The final twist is far more insidious. Turning to face them all, Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. General Ravenscroft, in his guilt and desperation, sought to cover up the truth. He knew Dorothea was alive, and when he discovered that Margaret had confronted her, he acted quickly to protect his family's reputation. He did not want to expose the truth that his beloved wife had been murdered by her own twin. The revelation hit like a thunderclap, each person in the room reeling from the impact. Major Hector Blunt's face turned ashen, while Mrs. Buckley gasped, her hand fluttering to her throat. The only one who seemed unaffected was Dr. Willoughby, whose face remained unreadable, his eyes betraying nothing. Poirot stepped closer to Celia, his eyes softening with a hint of empathy. Your father, Celia, did not want you to know the truth. He wanted to protect you from the horror of it all. But now, the past has caught up with us, and there is no escaping the truth. Celia's hands trembled as she pressed them to her chest. But why? Why now? Why reveal this after all these years? Poirot gave a small, rueful smile. Because, mademoiselle, the dead do not stay silent forever, and someone has gone to great lengths to keep this secret buried. He turned toward the window, the storm outside reflecting the chaos within. There are some who would do anything to keep the truth from coming to light. A sudden sound footsteps broke the air, and Poirot's instincts kicked in. The door to the mansion creaked open, and in the doorway stood a figure, tall and cloaked in shadows, their face hidden. Poirot's gaze locked onto the figure, his heart pounding with a mix of certainty and dread. The game was far from over. The final piece of the puzzle had yet to fall into place. Cliffhanger ending. As the figure stepped forward, a voice echoed through the room, low, familiar, and laced with venom. You think you know everything, Poirot. You think you've uncovered the truth. You're wrong. This story isn't over. Not by a long shot. The room fell into a stunned, suffocating silence as Poirot stood, his eyes narrowed and intense, fixed on the one person in the room who had been playing the game from the very start. Every corner of the Ravenscroft mansion seemed to hold its breath, as if even the walls were aware that the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. Poirot's finger slowly raised, pointing directly at Dr. Willoughby, who had remained eerily calm throughout the gathering, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression was one of practiced indifference, as though he had heard nothing of the storm Poirot had just unleashed. The doctor's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, just a flicker, but it was enough. Enough for Poirot to see it, enough to unravel the entire carefully crafted facade. Dr. Willoughby, Poirot said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of years of deception. You are the one who has pulled all the strings. You are the mastermind behind this twisted tale. It was you who manipulated Dorothea's fragile mind, who fed her delusions and gave her the push she needed to destroy her own sister, all for your gain. The words hit the room like a clap of thunder, and for a moment no one spoke. The housekeeper, Mrs. Buckley, gasped, clutching her pearls as her eyes darted between Poirot and Dr. Willoughby. Major Blunt stiffened, his face pale, while Celia's hands trembled, her breath catching in her throat. Ariadne, ever perceptive, leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and understanding. Dr. Willoughby's face, for the first time, flickered, a quick flash of something perhaps, or was it a deeper, more sinister emotion? It was gone almost instantly, replaced by his usual calm exterior. He smiled, though it was the smile of a man who knew he was in control of the situation, even in the face of Poirot's accusation. "Poirot," Dr. Willoughby said smoothly, his voice like silk, though it held an edge of warning. "You've built a marvelous story, but it's all conjecture. You have no evidence, no proof to back up your claims." Poirot's lips curled into a knowing smile, his eyes never leaving Dr. Willoughby's. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, my friend," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I have all the proof I need." He reached into his coat pocket, slowly pulling out a small weathered notebook. It was Margaret's diary, but there was more to it now, more than just a simple confession from a desperate woman. Inside, Poirot had found more than he had ever expected. This, Poirot said, his finger resting lightly on the diary, was not merely the musings of a troubled woman. It contained something far more important, something you thought would remain hidden forever. It contains a letter, written by Dorothea herself, addressed to none other than you, Dr. Willoughby. Poirot paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy with anticipation. A sharp intake of breath echoed from Celia, as she looked from Poirot to the doctor, her eyes wide with disbelief. Dr. Willoughby's face remained unmoved, but the tension in his jaw was undeniable. Poirot continued, unflinching. "The letter reveals everything," Poirot said, turning the diary over so that the pages rustled in the quiet room. "Dorothea was not the mastermind number. She was merely the instrument, the puppet in your twisted game. You manipulated her every thought, feeding her lies about Margaret, about her own identity. You made her believe she was the rightful heir to the Ravenscroft legacy. But all you cared about was the power you could gain by controlling the estate." Dr. Willoughby's eyes narrowed, and his hands clenched at his sides. The calm facade was starting to crack. "You know nothing of what you speak," he growled, the venom now clear in his voice. Poirot, ever the calm and precise detective, stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "You were not just the family's physician, Dr. Willoughby. You were a man who saw an opportunity in madness. You preyed on Dorothea's fragile psyche, and when she tried to kill Margaret, you helped cover it up. You made sure the truth remained hidden, because if the truth came out, your empire would crumble." The room seemed to tighten, the air thick with disbelief and dread. The others stood frozen, unable to comprehend the magnitude of Poirot's words. But Dr. Willoughby was no longer pretending to be a doctor or a man of calm reason. His mask had shattered, and his true self emerged cold, calculating, and ruthless. "You think you have everything figured out, Poirot," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. You think you can expose me, unravel my plan. You're wrong. The game isn't over yet." A sharp noise, something heavy falling to the floor, snapped the room to attention. Dr. Willoughby took a sudden step backward, his eyes darting toward the window, where the faintest shadow could be seen outside, watching. The storm raged outside, the wind howling against the walls, as if the world itself was closing in. Poirot's face tightened. He was aware now that the game was far from finished. But in that instant, as Dr. Willoughby's eyes flickered with a newfound, dangerous determination, Poirot knew. This wasn't just a fight for truth, it was a battle for survival. Cliffhanger ending. With a final, chilling laugh, Dr. Willoughby turned and bolted for the door, disappearing into the night, leaving Poirot and the others in stunned silence. But the sound of his retreating footsteps echoed in their minds, a grim reminder that the darkness of Ravenscroft's past had not yet released its hold. The game was far from over. The air was thick with a biting chill, as Poirot and Ariadne stood at the gates of Ravenscroft Mansion, the heavy wooden doors now firmly shut behind them. The mansion, once a symbol of dark mysteries and twisted secrets, stood silent in the fading light of the evening, as though it had exhaled a long-held breath and finally found peace. But for Poirot, the air was still filled with the lingering weight of everything that had unfolded, everything that had been revealed, and everything that had yet to be uncovered. Ariadne, her expression still tense from the whirlwind of events that had shaken their very souls, glanced over at Poirot. Her voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. "Do you believe it's truly over then, Hercule?" Poirot, ever the calm and composed figure, stood motionless for a long moment, his gaze fixed ahead. The once brilliant detective, whose mind had worked through the knots of countless cases, now seemed deep in thought, as if the shadow of Ravenscroft's secrets was still cast over him. "No, madame," Poirot said finally, his voice quiet, but sharp like a fine blade. "The case has been solved, yes, the truth revealed. But the heart, you see, it is a different matter altogether. The heart does not easily relinquish its secrets, not even to time." Ariadne tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "You're saying the answers we uncovered were only part of the story?" Poirot's lips curved into the smallest of smiles, a touch of sadness in his eyes, as he turned to face her. "It is a truth that is often overlooked. The mind, yes, the mind can decipher logic, uncover facts, and expose the hidden motives that lead to tragedy. But the heart, the heart, is a far more elusive thing. It holds its own secrets, its own betrayals, its own passions, that even the passage of time cannot erase." Ariadne felt a shiver pass through her. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that Poirot was not simply reflecting on the case, but on something far deeper. His words, so often precise, now seemed veiled in an unsettling truth. She wanted to ask him more, to probe further. But something about the finality in his tone told her that some mysteries like the ones that lay hidden in the hearts of men were not meant to be uncovered. Not yet. As they reached the edge of the town, the distant hum of life fading into the distance, Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the darkened silhouette of the Ravenscroft mansion, now barely visible against the encroaching night. "Perhaps, madame, it is the very nature of secrets," Poirot continued, as though he were speaking to himself, "that they never truly die. They simply wait. And when the time is right, they return, with a vengeance." The finality of his words seemed to hang in the air, unspoken yet understood, as they made their way toward the quiet town below. Just as they turned the corner, something caught Poirot's sharp eye. A small piece of paper, fluttering in the breeze near the foot of a lamppost. His instincts kicked in before his mind could register what it was, and with a quick motion, he bent to pick it up. Ariane glanced at him, puzzled. "What is it, Poirot?" Poirot unfurled the piece of paper, his eyes narrowing in the dimming light. A single, hastily written sentence was scrawled across it in a hurried, erratic hand. "The heart never forgets. Neither should you." Poirot stood frozen, the paper crinkling softly in his hands, his mind already racing. As the weight of the message settled in, it was a warning, a reminder. The game, it seemed, was not over. And this time there would be no escape from the shadows that had once again begun to stir. Cliffhanger ending. As the wind picked up, rustling the trees around them, Poirot slipped the paper into his coat pocket, his gaze intense and unwavering. "No, madame," he whispered softly, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. "The heart does not forget, and this mystery is far from finished." And with that, the last traces of daylight vanished, leaving them in the shadows, with the knowledge that whatever lay ahead was something even darker, and more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. "Can you solve the case before Poirot?"